Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm hearing a lot of echo. If you could mute the microphone in the room, that would be terrific. Great. Thank you for the honor of being with you this afternoon. For me, it's early in the morning. During the course of my presentation, next slide, please, I'll bring you on a little bit of a visit to the town of Framingham, Massachusetts. I can't quite tell which slide you're on, but slide 2 shows a view of Framingham where we had our first snow 2 days ago. A little bit ahead of the UK, I'm sure, where you only get a rare dusting. Next slide, please. In the course of this presentation, what I'd like to do is cover a few topics related to biobank activities, but give you a bit of a background on the Framingham Heart Study, our governance with regard to biobanks and in particular how we do genetic-related research. We'll talk about our establishment of an Ethics Advisory Board, or EAB, and I'll give an example of one of the great challenges we had to face and get our Ethics Advisory Board involved. Next slide, please. By the middle of the 20th century, epidemiological knowledge about cardiovascular disease was quite limited. Roughly half the deaths at that time in the United States were due to cardiovascular disease. The available statistics on mortality were collected by the government and the health insurance industry. They identified cardiovascular disease as a leading cause of death, but high-quality data on cardiovascular disease were virtually non-existent, and the underlying causes of cardiovascular disease were completely unknown at that time, and no effective treatments existed. Next slide, please. So the town of Framingham was selected in 1948 for a long-term observational study of cardiovascular disease. It was set up by the U.S. Public Health Service. There were several reasons for why the town of Framingham was chosen. It had been the site of a successful tuberculosis study during World War I. Some of the physicians from Framingham who cooperated in the tuberculosis study were still practicing. Framingham was close to local teaching hospitals and to Harvard, and it had a low unemployment rate and a population that was quite stable at that time. Next slide. It was decided to recruit about 5,000 healthy men and women from Framingham and put them through extensive evaluations, a medical history, physical exam, laboratory tests, chest x-ray, and electrocardiogram, and to bring those individuals back approximately every 2 years for the development of cardiovascular disease. When the study first began, it was estimated that it would take about 20 years of follow-up of these initially healthy 5,000 people for there to be enough cardiovascular disease events to make connections between observations made at baseline and the occurrence of disease over the course of time. Fortunately, it took a little bit less than 20 years, and by the early to mid-1960s, the work from Framingham helped identify many of the early risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Things like high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol levels, a little bit later cigarette smoking, a little bit later still HDL cholesterol, diabetes, etc., became identified in part from work from Framingham on the elucidation of risk factors for cardiovascular disease. The study began recruiting a second generation of participants in the early 1970s, and this was about 5,000 children and spouses of children of the original study cohort. And beginning in 2002, we started the recruitment of a third generation of study participants, and these were grandchildren of the original study participants. So we were funded for 3,500 people, and we ended up recruiting over 4,000 of these individuals to our third generation study. Next slide, please. The Framingham Heart Study is a joint study of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and Boston University. We have a number of governing committees involved in Framingham, and involved in policy establishment. And the central committee that we have is our executive committee. And under our executive committee, in an advisory capacity, is a genetic steering committee that will give us guidance on genetic research projects. I mentioned that it's a dual project of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which provides oversight as well as other government agencies, such as the Office of Management and Budget. In addition, we partner with Boston University, and our institutional review board is from Boston University. We have independent oversight of many of our activities, and this is particularly important regarding genetic research, from an observational studies monitoring board and an independent external DNA committee that is responsible for approving requests for access to genetic material. Lastly, and particularly relevant for today's meeting, is the establishment of an ethics advisory board to help give recommendations to our study about ethical activities. What is the ethics advisory board charged with? Next slide, please. It's charged with considering complex questions that we pose or our study participants pose to them about any sort of matter that might fall under the rubric of ethics. It gives an opportunity to provide viewpoints of study participants in the community and to advise the executive committee. Next slide, please. Justin, we should be on slide number 9. Here's an example of one of our newsletters that we sent out to all our study participants across all 3 generations. This would have been 10 years ago, advising them and notifying them that we had set up panels that recommended the establishment of an ethics advisory board. And next slide, please. We explained in that newsletter that the charge of the Ethics Advisory Board was to help us with complex decision-making, to advise us and make recommendations, and to keep you informed about matters that may be of concern to you. We'll publish summaries of the Ethics Advisory Board's opinions in our regular newsletters. And we gave them an opportunity for them to ask questions or pose questions to the questions into one of our study coordinators. Slide number 11. One of the very first tasks we charged the Ethics Advisory Board with was helping us with our informed consent for genetic research. And here's some information on that informed consent process. This is on slide number 11. Data and DNA in our informed consent, we notify participants will be distributed to Framingham researchers and other qualified researchers. The research will be given, researchers will be given DNA without any identifying information. Information gained from research on your DNA may be used for the development of diagnostic procedures and new treatments. Your DNA will not be sold to any person, institution, or company for financial gain or commercial profit. And slide number 12, you may choose to withdraw your blood samples at a future date, and your samples will be destroyed at that time. The coded samples will be stored securely, etc. You will be kept informed through periodic publications about, from the heart study, of any findings from your DNA. We went on with the input of the Ethics Advisory Board, slide 13, please, to alter our informed consent to specifically give participants the opportunity to opt in or opt out of several different types of research. Question number 1 in the informed consent allowed participants to opt in or out of the core examination in Framingham. Question number 2 allowed participants to opt in and out for the collection of a blood sample from which DNA and other components could be extracted. And question number 3 gave participants the opportunity to opt in and opt out of the collection of immortalized cell lines. it was quite clear even 10 or 15 years ago that our genetic stores of DNA were quite limited, and that requests for DNA might exceed our ability to supply DNA to researchers. And for that reason, we began collecting immortalized cell lines and extracted DNA from those immortalized cell lines. How did participants respond to these different questions? Slide number 14. We took a survey and looked at the results of participant preferences regarding participation in the exam. We had no one who refused participation in their consent. Regarding genetics, genetic research was refused by 2 study participants, and cell lines were refused by 4 study participants. So clearly the overwhelming majority of study participants agreed to these various aspects that were delineated in the consent form. Let's move on to slide number 15, and I'll describe for you one of the major challenges that the study has faced involvement, which is over a quarter of a century. Slide number 16. I wrote a book called A Change of Heart that summarized some of the history of the Framingham Heart Study and some of the big challenges that we faced over time. And perhaps the greatest challenge we ever faced was in the year 2000 when the university affiliated with Framingham decided to set up a for-profit company that was going to be called Framingham Genomic Medicine. And it was announced in the local newspaper that the university had set up this for-profit entity that presumably would use participant data and DNA in a for-profit kind of way. Study participants revolted. Here's a quote, "They're not selling my data," and from one of the longstanding Framingham participants reacting to the disclosure that the university was attempting to start up a for-profit. Next slide, please, slide 17. Another study participant said that after attending her 26 voluntary appointments over the course of more than a half century, Evelyn Langley was livid. She was reading and hearing speculation that her personal medical information would be sold and that a private for-profit company stood to make money off her and her neighbors' altruism. And one thing that we learned very clearly is that 2 things that don't mix are altruism and profit. A very important lesson. By the way, I had nothing to do with the startup of this company and was as astonished as our study participants were to learn about it. We got involved with advisory groups in slide number 18 to address this issue. We included a clause in the consent provisions to allow participants to opt in or opt out, and we only accepted a yes as an opt-in clause to allow researchers from private companies to have access to DNA and genetic data. So we included this clause on subsequent informed consent forms. And one thing that you will see on slide number 19 is that the Framingham offspring cohort, the group that was most directly affected by the attempt to create a for-profit company, and by the way, the company was scuttled in the course of some of this controversy. The university pulled the plug on the company and it never moved forward. You can see that 8% of study participants declined allowing their data to be shared with a for-profit entity. In the offspring cohort, in the 3rd generation cohort, which was unaffected by this crisis directly, only 2% of individuals in the 3rd generation refused allowing their data or DNA sample to be shared with an entity. I'll close at this point, slide number 20, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you a little bit of an overview of Framingham, our governance, our establishment of an ethics advisory board, and one of the great challenges that we faced in our history. Thank you very much.